As part of preparing for this week's sermon, I reread my sermon from last year on this topic, I am not a racist. In I am not a racist, I made the case for a very personal and local interpretation of what we know as structural racism or white supremacy culture. We all benefit from and participate in the racist inequalities that exist in America today. Since then, events in the news have continued to reinforce the message that a deep and pervasive injustice is being perpetrated. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, the march of victims of police brutality continues. And many of us in the church have taken steps to educate ourselves and each other on white supremacy and its effects. So the motivation for anti-racism as an article of faith and a spiritual practice is by now, I hope, self-evident. White supremacy, whether intentional or not, is an apparent violation of our first principle, that each person has inherent dignity and worth. Once we come to understand that an injustice is occurring, we want to fix it as part of living out our faith. But it's so very hard to find ways to help that do in fact help. So often our attempts at healing the wounds of racism have wound up perpetuating or contributing to it. My sermon from last year was pretty short on actionable advice. I advocated for becoming an ally or even an accomplice in the service of assisting people of color. For those who didn't hear that sermon or have slept since then, an accomplice in this context is someone who will put themselves at personal risk, including risk from persons in authority, in order to help those suffering from oppression. But that's a huge leap, and being told to leap is not helpful when what we're looking to do is take steps. I've spent the past year trying some things and listening to people with far more experience in this than me. I'm not anywhere close to a solution, but can at least share some parts of my journey. Now, I'll never be able to watch the movie version of My Fair Lady the same way again. In the scene from our reading, Professor Higgins is undertaking to fix Eliza Doolittle's accent and manners to make her acceptable to British high society. I know this is lifted out of context. The movie itself is a parody of misogyny, and the play it is based on, George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, makes the classism in it more clear. But this is where the message comes full circle. When those of us with privilege attempt to work with oppressed people, we tend to do this by holding ourselves up as models, just as Higgins does. How we speak, how we carry ourselves, the economic choices we make, and any other personal attributes we believe have contributed to our success are presented as objectively better than any others. And if they would do those things too, they would succeed. It may be that some of those attributes are worth sharing, but those of us with privilege will never be able to tell, because those choices are made in a context where we're being rewarded more for our whiteness than for the specific things we do. I don't want to suggest that those of us who have done that sort of thing aren't trying. Oftentimes this kind of help is very well received and individuals can benefit from it. The movie The Blind Side, where the Toohey family rescues a young man from the ghetto, has been called out as an egregious example of white saviorism. The movie won several awards, not just for Sandra Bullock's performance, but for its overall effect. Bill Cosby was at times highly respected as a critic of Black culture. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram X. Kendi recounts his own instances of anti-Blackness and racism, and how he was applauded for them. But in the end, Kendi argues that by treating cultures as unequal, we move further away from the eventual goal of judging individuals' actions as just or unjust, rather than their whole personhoods. Seeing white saviorism on a scale of devoting all one's free time, or even one's life, to something that in the end seems to have done more harm than good is saddening to behold. It can make us want to play it safe. We donate a little money to political candidates and charities. We consume lots of news stories on the awfulness of the current administration. Some of us even push a little harder and attend our protests in the woodlands or do deeper study in books and discussion groups. These are definitely helpful. Charities will take all the support they can get, and educating ourselves on the impacts of racism is a necessary first step toward correcting them. Demonstrations are very useful as educational tools. They highlight issues and can reach people who are not otherwise paying attention. All of those things are steps along the way. They're useful to the extent that they lead people, including the participants, to look for more committed and effective ways to take action. I'm going to suggest that there are three things. Now, I know that Rob Wiley has the Northwoods patent on this, but three things that can guide us away from white saviorism and help us have a better impact. One is our own interests as white people. Two, our faith principles. And three, an ability to follow. First, let's look away from self-sacrifice for a moment and think of what those of us who have white privilege stand to gain in a more just world. Evidence is building that our culture of self-reliance is having bad effects on our health. Recently, the life expectancy of Black and white men has been moving closer together, but it's been through a shortening of white life expectancy for the most part. Addiction and depression are bigger killers than ever. But those objective signs tend to affect marginalized working class whites more than relatively wealthy, educated suburbanites, like most of us at Northwoods. It's relatively easy to write them off as Trump voters and believe that middle class whites are going to need to make sacrifices, the road back to white saviorism. But white supremacy is damaging middle class folks like me as well. Those of us who are not living paycheck to paycheck greatly fear that we'll be there soon. It pushes us toward a scarcity mentality, constantly worrying about whether we have enough to retire, to educate our children, etc. That mentality is exploited by zero-sum politics. If those people get too much, disaster will befall us. White supremacy culture encourages us to dissociate from discomfort, from the suffering of others, the recognition of the basis of our wealth, even from our own bodies. When we don't like what we hear, Black anger, for instance, we remove ourselves from the situation because we can. Most saddening for me is the idea that white Americans who've been in this country for generations have left Europe behind, but have no identifiable American culture beyond a celebration of power. It feels like no culture at all. Now, in our reading from Kendi, he warns us against self-interest as a motivator. It's self-interest that leads us to narrow solutions, letting us take comfort when our personal needs are met at the expense of others. Our faith can put guardrails on this self-interest. If we believe that every person has inherent dignity and worth, then we can rule out solutions that benefit some at the expense of others. Kendi believes that this should lead us to put policy solutions ahead of changing hearts and minds. One can see examples of this working. Post-Obamacare, most of us now believe that healthcare is a right. Relationships outside of cisgendered heterosexuality feature prominently in the media and are supported by corporate America. That perspective can help us see the time and effort we give to anti-racist efforts as investment in a better future for everyone. Allyship or being an accomplice is not something white people can ever claim for themselves. That's up to oppressed people to say. But white people can be in solidarity with the oppressed, working toward policy changes that lift up the most oppressed and so lift all others as well. Now, perhaps the most repeated piece of advice that I've come across for white people starting to do anti-racist work is most succinctly put in the latest UU World. Don't start your own thing. We are very capable people and can make good things happen, but we'll have more impact when we can lend our public activist energy to Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led groups that are already doing the work. The vigils at First Church and our own protests in the Woodlands and similar efforts are a good thing, but we can do more by lending our energy to people for whom, from their own experience, know what they need. I didn't want to put the TED Talk on shirtless dancing guy in the reading since it's been done to death, at least for some of us. But if you have somehow missed it, it's shirtless dancing guy, put that into your favorite search engine and watch. The point of the video is that the leader is just a guy out dancing by himself until someone joins him, the crucial first follower, and the leader responds positively. It's nice to be a leader, but a movement is a true success when the first followers make it so. So I want us to challenge ourselves to be that kind of follower. Now, another piece of advice from that same article is to decenter whiteness and stop preaching the sermon about coming to terms with it. At this point, those of us who have white privilege and are willing to say so have gotten the point. So this is the second and last time you'll hear me addressing my skinfolk, fellow white people, from the pulpit. We may not know all of what we need to do or how to go about doing it, but we're underway and the work is much too desperately needed for us to stop. All of us here from every background are learning and growing, and I'm incredibly thankful for the growth opportunity and for the chance to share it with you. Thank you so much for listening.